Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History by Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor James McGrath. Today we're going to be discussing the historical connections between John the Baptist and Jesus and their followers. So James, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. Always a pleasure to have a conversation with you about one of these many topics that we are both interested in.
Yeah, likewise. So did the historical John the Baptist and Jesus, did they have theologically identical beliefs? Or were their theological views more different than we thought?
Oh, that's a good question, and yeah, way to start with an easy one. So it's difficult to say because when it comes to both the historical Jesus and the historical John the Baptist, uh, scholars using historical methods approach both with some skepticism with respect to whether we're really hearing the actual perspective of either of these figures in the narrative presentation that we get in, say, the Gospels, right? But also when it comes to Josephus, right, talking about John the Baptist and presumably something about Jesus in there as well, even if it's been tampered with by scribes. There are some points of contact with the Gospel depiction and the depiction in Josephus, but they're also rather different in some important ways. And so it's actually a really challenging question to answer. My own direction in my research leads me to think that they were largely in agreement. Right? That doesn't mean they agreed on absolutely everything. It's very rare for two people to agree on absolutely everything, so it'd be quite surprising if they did. But it seems to me that the fundamental outlook was the same. And the Gospel of Matthew is one source that actually explicitly states that, in saying that John the Baptist was proclaiming a message that could be summarized in exactly the same way as the message of Jesus was summarized, right? And so he places on the lips of both, repent and believe the good news, for the kingdom of God is at hand.
What do we know anything about their differences? Do we know where Jesus and John differed exactly?
There are a couple of things that come up in the Gospels. One of them is that there's a question about John the Baptist's followers not fasting, fasting when Jesus' followers were not. And that presumably connects with some teaching attributed to Jesus to the effect that when you fast, you should hide the fact, right? You shouldn't let anybody be able to see this, because then you'll be rewarded by God, right? If you allow people to see that you're fasting, then you're getting acclamation. It's like, oh, good, you're fasting, very pious, and so you're getting some reward now, right? And if you really want God to reward you for something, then do it for God alone and let only God know about it, right? And Jesus says something similar about prayer. And so given that, right, it's not that Jesus' followers were not fasting, right? They're fasting but hiding it. But the fact that people didn't have the same question about John the Baptist followers, John the Baptist followers didn't, had a question about Jesus' movement and something, different versions, different gospels have different versions about who asks the question and who raises the issue. But they're both fasting, and Jesus has innovated, I would say, on John's foundation, right? In the Mandaean Book of John, no, actually, it's in the Genza Rabbah, the Great Treasure. There is a teaching that is very much like what we find in the Gospels. When you give charity, don't let the right hand know what the left is doing. And so that idea of keeping secret when you're doing good, John may have started that, and Jesus may just have applied John's teaching and principle to fasting in a way that John himself had not done, or at least had not done explicitly, or had not had the idea to do, right? When there's a movement, you often have people who are followers, people who are leaders, but not the head honcho, as it were, innovating, right, on the foundation that the leader or founder has laid. And I think Jesus did that, right? The other point of contrast that sometimes comes up is Jesus saying something about John not eating and drinking, whereas Jesus is eating and drinking. And there we have some sort of difference, right? It's hard to know exactly what the difference was, whether it was Jesus accepting invitations to share in table fellowship, whereas John, as a rule, refused. Whether it was something about locusts and wild honey, but we have no indication that John the Baptist taught his followers to eat what he ate, right? And so there too, it seems like it's a difference rather than anything that would constitute a disagreement. And so that would be my way of framing it. Is I think that Jesus and John differed, but as far as we can tell, we don't actually have any example of a disagreement. I would add, except in Mandaic sources, where Jesus gets blamed for some things that Christianity did, like baptizing in non-flowing water and celibacy and things like that. And it's not clear that those things that are criticized go back to Jesus. And so it's clear that the evolving John the Baptist movement that didn't become Christianity and the evolving John the Baptist movement that did become Christianity moved in different directions and had disagreements. The question is, does any of that go back to the time of John and Jesus? And it's at the very least not clear that any of it does.
Did Jesus inherit much of his teachings and theological viewpoints from John the Baptist? Does John baptizing Jesus indicate that he was the precursor to Jesus historically?
Yeah, I mean, I think it shows that he is a precursor historically in the sense that John appears on the scene first and makes a big splash and gets a lot of attention, and Jesus comes along and seems to join John's movement, right? That's what being baptized by John indicates, an acceptance of this message that John is proclaiming. And when Jesus later steps into the role of essentially trying to regroup John's followers after John is imprisoned, and is continuing that activity, and Herod Antipas hears about what's happening, his perception is that John the Baptist, whom he beheaded, had been raised from the dead. And that is not necessarily something that we have confidence that Herod Antipas actually said that and the gospel authors knew about it. But it must have seemed plausible to the gospel authors that someone would hear about what Jesus was doing, what Jesus was teaching, the kind of movement that he was involved in leading, and the kinds of activities he was carrying out, and have thought that John the Baptist was back, right? That indicates a very high degree of continuity in message, in actions, emphases, so on and so forth. And so, yeah, I think that Jesus got a lot from John, and the high esteem in which Jesus held John probably indicates that as well.
When exactly does the Gospels think that John the Baptist was killed? And my second question to that is, does Josephus present a complication in understanding the chronology between John the Baptist and Jesus? Does Josephus seem to indicate John the Baptist died after Jesus, or not really?
Yeah, that's another great question, and it's difficult to answer. Sorry, I had a brief interruption there, but I will carry on.
Okay.
Yeah. As soon as it started, as soon as the spinning wheel started, I stopped talking. So you ask a great question, and what's interesting is that both in our earliest Christian source about John the Baptist, the Gospel of Mark, and in Josephus, the story is told kind of as a flashback, right? So in the Gospel of Mark, Herod Antipas says, hey, it looks like John, whom I beheaded, is back. And then Mark seems to be like, oh yeah, I'd better tell that story, right? It's interesting that Matthew's gospel, copying from him, forgets that it's supposed to be a flashback, and so at the end of the story, he just sort of carries on where the news about John's beheading is being delivered to Jesus, as though this event had just happened. Whereas in Mark, it's a flashback. In Josephus, Josephus tells the story in the context of Herod Antipas being defeated by the king of Arabia, Aretas. And it appears there as an aside because Josephus says that popular opinion was that Herod Antipas's defeat was payback for what Herod Antipas did to John. And when we put the gospel information and Josephus together, then we can see why it would have made sense to connect the two, right? Because the argument that Josephus is mentioning it, in the context of these later events, and therefore John was probably executed later, has to also include the argument that Josephus would not have connected these events if John had been executed significantly earlier. Right? And the possible connection that the historical evidence points to, right, when we take the Gospels and Josephus together, is that the Gospels say that John the Baptist criticized Herod Antipas for his divorce and remarriage. And the first wife that he divorced in order to marry his brother's wife, right? And there's another divorce there. But his divorce of his first wife was him divorcing the daughter of King Aretas of Arabia, right? We had been married to. And so the whole conflict with Aretas that leads to Aretas then basically kicking his butt happens because they fell out of favor, because Herod Antipas mistreated Aretas' daughter in that way, right? And so that's, that would have, if people were aware that John had criticized Antipas for this, then connecting the two would have made perfect sense, right? And so when we put the Gospels and Josephus together, and neither seems to be trying to emphasize a point or to say this thing, but the two naturally sort of fit together, that often is a good sign that each of us is giving us part of the story. Neither is simply concocting something, and that we're getting a glimpse of the history here. So I don't think Josephus's setting, the context in which he tells the story, requires a significantly later dating for John's execution than the Gospels would imply.
So would you say that John the Baptist was killed later, or would you say that he still died before Jesus?
I have the impression that he died before Jesus, and one of the things that I think is at least part of the case for that, other than the simple fact that it's stated in the Gospels, is the fact that John's death offers a logical explanation for why Jesus might have been anticipating his own death, right? And one has to approach the predictions of the crucifixion, resurrection, things like that with due skepticism. But on the other hand, most messianic movements die out when you execute the leader. And the Jesus movement famously survives, right, and thrives thereafter. And if Jesus had not been the sort of figure and someone who spoke in such a way as to make it seem feasible that this was all part of God's plan, then probably the message would have had simply no traction. And so there are things in the Gospels that indicate Jesus basically embracing a non-glorious fate, at least as a stepping stone to him being installed as ruler, judge of the nations, and so on. And Jerome Murphy O'Connor, the famous New Testament scholar, and who also does a lot of work with archaeology, makes the case, I think, pretty convincingly that when we take the topography of the Mount of Olives and the fact that the arrest of Jesus is said to have happened while he was there, if an armed group, right, coming out that doesn't look like just another group of pilgrims is approaching, if any particularly large group, suspiciously large group, is approaching, you can spot that, right? And you don't have the custom, it says that Jesus was praying, his disciples fell asleep, but even so, right, I mean, there's so much room to escape in that context, unless you are actually deliberately embracing what happened, right? And Jesus seems, according to the prayer that is attributed to him in that context, to have wanted to get out of something that was going to happen to him, right? He also talks in these intriguing sayings about having a baptism to undergo. And when a couple of his disciples ask if they can sit on thrones alongside him, he asks, can you be baptized with the baptism that I'm going to be baptized with? And John talked about a baptism coming, a baptism of fire, right? That sounds like a depiction of judgment, right? Because it's connected with, the stronger one who comes has his threshing, has his fan and his threshing fork, and he's going to take the chaff, everything that's not worthwhile in the threshing floor, and it's going to be burned, right? And so the image of fire and baptism of fire seems to be an image of judgment. So why is Jesus talking about undergoing a baptism of this sort, right? Presumably it's not the baptism that he already had experienced with John, right? And that's not one to feel like you have to avoid. And so the idea that Jesus saw himself as having to follow in John's footsteps, that makes a lot of historical sense in terms of some of the things that are attributed to Jesus along those lines.
So, does understanding the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus also assist in reconstructing the historical Jesus?
I think it can. I mean, I think it has to be part of the picture because Jesus says there was no one greater, right? And so understanding an individual that another individual thinks is the best person who ever lived is going to give us some insight into them, right? On the other hand, we have less about John the Baptist, even across all our sources, and some of it is, if we bring, for instance, the Mandaean sources into the picture, they are significantly later in their current form, right? The final form in which we encounter them, and so we need a lot more work to be done on those sources, looking at them with an openness to or a direct focus on the possibility that they can tell us something about the historical John the Baptist, even if they're written later. Without that, it just becomes very difficult to use John to help us understand the historical Jesus. In fact, in my recent book project, what I tried to do is to reverse the order and say, can the historical Jesus tell us some important things about John, right? Can we, if we treat Jesus as part of John's movement, John's follower, and eventually, stepping into a role of leader of that movement, does that allow us to fill in more of the picture of John? But I think both of them, there's a connection there that has to be part of discussion of either historically.
Do you think that John really saw Jesus as the Messiah?
I think we don't know. I think it's possible. I think the range of possibilities includes that he did, that he didn't, and that he had no opinion on the subject whatsoever. There is a message in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. It's attributed to the Q source for those who view things that way, where John sends a question to Jesus about whether he is the coming one. And that's sometimes been treated as expressing doubt.
You're back now.
Okay. It says recording error. Does everything look okay on your side?
Yeah, it's okay for me. I don't know what's going on.
Fine. Yeah. I don't know. It seems like, even though university networks are usually supposed to be good, it just seems not to like when I try to record. It seems like, despite the fact that at home I'd have to do it on Wi-Fi, it still seems like there's always an interruption. At any rate, so let's see. We're talking about.
We were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The message to John. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So is that where I'd gotten up to? So yeah. So yeah. In Matthew and Luke, there is a message from John that is attributed to him, and so it would come from the Q source for those who hold that view of things. And because Matthew has John recognize Jesus as the greater one, the stronger one, the one by whom he himself needs to be baptized early in his gospel, right? And that's something that Matthew's making up. It's not found in any of our other sources or earlier sources. But because of that, some have taken the question then to be an expression of doubt, right? But that recognition is not in the Q source. It's not in, it's not presumably, given that's not included in Luke, it's something that was recognizable, even if you think that Luke used Matthew, was recognizable as Matthew adding something, right? Which means that there's no need to take that as expressing doubt, right? It can be a genuine question, right? Are you going to step into this role, or are you just stepping into the role of continuing what I was doing since I've been in prison, and somebody else is going to come along, right? It might even be an invitation. Hey, have you thought about stepping into this role, right? It's even possible that it was a bit of a coded message. It's like, hey, are you the stronger one who might do the kind of thing like get me out of prison, And so all that, of course, assuming that there's any historical basis for this, right? It's also possible that John had no opportunity to send any messages to Jesus after he was imprisoned, right? If that's when this happened, right? Which is, again, something that only Matthew specifies. Sending messages, right, from prison seems like something that you might not be allowed to do, right? And might not have a great freedom to do. And so it may be that the gospel authors or the author of the Q source was trying to attribute to John something as close as possible to a recognition, given that John had been imprisoned and executed without having had the chance to publicly say anything about whether Jesus was the coming one. It seems to me the way that Jesus steps into the role of regrouping that movement after John's imprisonment hints that at the very least there was a close connection between John and Jesus. Maybe Jesus was rising as a leader in the movement, was a potential candidate to step into that role. I'd say most likely, all things being equal, John never had a chance to comment. And to be fair, even the Gospels, other than the Gospel of John, don't say otherwise, right? Matthew has this little, I recognize you, but it's just a private conversation between John and Jesus. The Gospel of John introduces, he must increase and I must decrease. And so we can see that this is something that's being added to the tradition. And so I think the best view to hold historically is that John had no opportunity. His life was cut short, and he had no opportunity to see Jesus step into the role of leader of the movement and do enough in that capacity in order to prompt from John some indication. Yes, everybody, give him your backing, right?
And now I want to ask about how the Q source relates to this. If Q exists, what does Q tell us about John the Baptist and Jesus? And if it didn't exist and Luke knew Matthew, what are the implications of that?
Yeah. So when I write about things like the Q source, I always try to work with the predominant hypothesis that is the prevailing view even today, and yet to also try to not make my conclusions depend entirely on that, right? Because ultimately, if you think that Matthew knew Luke or Luke knew Matthew, you still have this body of teaching that both thought was worth including, both thought had connection with Jesus. And so it's still relevant in that regard. Obviously, if it is something that predates Matthew and thus also Luke, or predates Matthew and Luke, then it's earlier and potentially of more historical value. The Q source, as far as we can tell, right, the earliest material that shows up in Matthew and Luke that's not from Mark is about John the Baptist. And then we have a focus on John the Baptist later on. And then throughout, we have Jesus talking about the kinds of things that John the Baptist taught. We have things like ethical teaching that at least sometimes intersect with John's emphases as we find them in the Gospels, and also intersect with ethical teaching attributed to John in the Mandaean Book of John. And so it seems to me that the Q source, if it existed, indicates that one of the earliest pieces of Christian literature was aimed at addressing how Jesus and John related to one another, right? That the reason why it starts with John is that John is the start, right? And to the extent that it also focused on Jesus, it's within the framework of John as the starting point of all the stuff that's been happening.
So you would say that even if it turned out that Matthew and Luke one used the other, however that happened, um, it wouldn't. You think it wouldn't affect it too much the way that the Q material, the double tradition material, is used to understand John and Jesus.
I mean, it would certainly affect how we see the development of early Christian thinking about John, Jesus, and the relationship between the two. But most would say that Luke wrote later than these other Gospels. There certainly are some who make Luke Matthew's source, right? And that's a possibility. Matthew, whatever you think of source material other than Mark that he may have used, explicitly attributes to both John and Jesus the same phrases, right, and the same message. The Gospel of Luke starts not with Jesus, but with John and his parents. And so both of these Gospels, in and of themselves, right, and not just the stuff that they overlap on, indicates that John is the sort of starting point of all this. And both through what they include and through the way that they seem to be wrestling with some of the potential implications of that, there is an effort to elevate Jesus, both through his connection with John, but also in relation to John. I know sometimes I don't want to say over against John, because all of these sources are indicating continuity between John and Jesus to a very great extent, but elevating him so that, as the stronger one, he is greater. I think it's telling that in the Gospel of John, maybe aware of that saying that of Jesus, praising John the Baptist as the greatest person who ever lived, couldn't just say, Jesus is just so obviously greater, right? It says, he must increase and I must decrease, right? So the only way to get Jesus greater than John is for John, as the greatest person who ever lived, to decrease, to make some room for him, as it were. I think that's really interesting.
So which community do you think Q originated from specifically? Was it some kind of Baptist variant community, or community that was more Jesus centered? Like, what do we know about that? What can we tell?
Yeah, I would say that it seems to be connected with the same strands of developing Christianity that, for all their diversity, are sharing literature, are incorporating earlier texts into what they create. And so, even if there are geographical, authorial, and other differences between say Luke and Matthew, there's still these connections, right? They're sharing source material, and Q, I think, is part of that. It may take us earlier, right? It may have more of a focus on John the Baptist. That might be one reason why, if it existed, it was not preserved by what was becoming Christianity, right? That all the important stuff that dealt with Jesus and his relation to John made it into Matthew or Luke or both. But it seems to me that all of these sources indicate that the Jesus movement is a subset of the Baptist movement, right? It's the Baptist movement claiming that the fulfillment of John's prediction of a stronger one is happening, and Jesus is the one. Right? And it seems to me that it's too early at any point in sort of this New Testament literature to talk about a Jesus movement over against a John the Baptist movement. Right? Maybe with the Gospel of John, we get a sense that there's a group of followers of John the Baptist who are not persuaded, right? But I think that's there all along. I don't know that we have any reason to think that it was ever the case that all of John's followers align themselves with Jesus. Some may not even have kept in touch, right? Things may have scattered. They may have gone back to Samaria or wherever, other places. We get the kind of splintering of John's movement. I think that probably the crucifixion of Jesus would have dealt a blow. And for some, Jesus' death it's like, oh, John and Jesus suffering and dying as a means of God bringing about the kingdom. Okay, we can work with that. Right? Jesus' death makes sense of John's death too. Let's connect the two. Let's run with this. And others must have said, yeah, Jesus clearly was not the coming one, and so we should keep waiting. And so I think that it was after the crucifixion probably that we get some of that splintering. And I think that some of the figures that arise that Josephus talks about right later in the first century probably were, they probably bore such a close resemblance to Jesus and to John because they were influenced by John and his prediction as well.
Did John the Baptist and Jesus predict the same sort of things?
I think so. It's interesting. So one of the proposals I make in my books about John the Baptist is that when Jesus talked about the coming Son of Man, that he was talking about John's coming one, right? Son of Man is not a title. It couldn't function as a title in Aramaic because it's just a way of saying someone, a person, a human being. And so it seems to me that Jesus talking about the coming of the Son of Man in that way, the coming one, is essentially, for all intents and purposes, continuing John's message. And one of the key questions historians have is, did Jesus actually explicitly, implicitly, subtly and not so subtly identify himself with that figure? Or did he just continue talking about, right, when the coming one, when John's prediction is fulfilled, right? It seems to me that there must have been some identification within the span of Jesus' lifetime, because we get sayings attributed to him like, that Jesus' followers, right, appointing 12 apostles to represent him and to go out and spread the message, that they will sit on 12 tribes judging the 12 tribes of Israel, right? And that assumes that Jesus, and presumably Jesus and John, right, have a higher status in this, right? And so it seems to me that Jesus must have viewed himself as stepping into that role. And it's really hard to pin down what the framework was for that understanding of these dual figures. It's interesting that the book of Revelation has these two lampstands, right, that are witnesses in Jerusalem, and both are killed and then both are raised from the dead. And the two lampstands, of course, is an image from the book of Zechariah, and it's the two messiahs, right, which were the priestly anointed one, the high priest, and the royal one. And so I think that at some point, Jesus, it's hard, we can't really trace this back to John. We don't necessarily have any reason to think that he didn't explore this, but it's certainly not explicit. But at the very least, Jesus probably started to entertain the idea that John had been a priestly messiah who carried out a quasi-priestly role in a very untraditional and non-standard way, and that it was his destiny for himself, Jesus, to be the royal messiah and to also do that in a way that was sort of out of left field and taking everybody by surprise, and not the way that was expected to be done.
Well, thank you for joining me today, James.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I find this stuff fascinating. I hope you do too, and I hope your viewers and listeners also do, because I feel like John doesn't get enough attention, and so I'm hoping that with your help we can get some of the attention back onto him that I think he deserves.
And I'll have the links to James McGrath's books in the description below and also in the pinned comment.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.